In just 6 short years, a single global conflict would claim a staggering number of lives, with estimates varying wildly from 40 million to over 80 million people. It would shatter empires and unleash technology that forever altered the course of human history. It was, without a doubt, the deadliest war the world has ever known. It redrew the map, forged new nations, and split the globe into 2 opposing ideological camps, setting the stage for a Cold War that would hang over the world for decades. From the development of the first electronic computers to the terrifying dawn of the atomic age, the innovations of this period still echo in our modern world. The war was a crucible of human suffering and technological leaps, a story of both unthinkable brutality and extraordinary heroism. And it all started right here, September 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland. This one act of aggression was the spark that set the entire world on fire. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish depot at Westerplatte. At the same time, over 1 million German troops stormed across the border, backed by the devastating power of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, which carried out some of the first large-scale city bombings of the war. Hitler's refusal to pull out of Poland forced Britain and France to declare war just 2 days later, on September 3rd. In this video, we'll break down how those first shots in Poland spiraled into a 6-year conflict that truly did change everything. The invasion of Poland was a terrifying display of a new type of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't the static trench warfare of the First World War. It was a strategy built on speed, surprise, and simply overwhelming force. German panzer divisions, their powerful tanks, punched holes deep into enemy lines while dive bombers acted like flying artillery, sowing chaos and terror. These armored spearheads would bypass heavily defended spots, driving deep into the rear to cut communication lines, encircle huge numbers of enemy troops, and paralyze the opposition. The Polish army, though incredibly brave, was caught between 2 giants. While fighting desperately against the Germans from the west on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This was part of a secret deal in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a so-called non-aggression treaty that had secretly planned to carve Poland up between Hitler and Stalin. By October 6th, Poland had been completely overrun, partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. After Poland fell so quickly, a strange quiet fell over Western Europe. This period, from late 1939 into the spring of 1940, became known as the Phony War. Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, but almost no fighting happened on the Western Front. It was a tense time of waiting, mobilizing, and planning, but the massive German attack everyone expected never came. The world held its breath, wondering what Hitler's next move would be. The answer arrived in April 1940. The Phony War ended with a bang when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing its northern flank and protecting vital iron ore shipments from Sweden. Then, on May 10, 1940, the full power of the Blitzkrieg was unleashed on Western Europe, as German forces invaded France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands all at once. The main Allied armies moved into Belgium, thinking Germany would repeat its World War I strategy and attack through the flat plains of Flanders. But the Germans had a masterful and incredibly daring plan. While a smaller force attacked Belgium and the Netherlands to draw the Allies in, the main German armored force drove through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. The French High Command had considered the hilly, dense forest totally unsuitable for tanks, a fatal mistake. German panzers poured out of the woods, completely bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line, France's massive chain of defenses on the German border, and raced for the English Channel. The Allied forces in Belgium were cut off, their supply and communication lines severed. They were trapped, with their backs to the sea. What happened next was one of the most desperate and legendary moments of the war: the evacuation from Dunkirk. Pinned against the coast, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers, mostly British and French, seemed doomed. In what became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, the British Royal Navy, along with a citizens' flotilla of fishing boats, yachts, and anything else that could float, raced across the channel under constant attack from the Luftwaffe. For 9 days, this makeshift armada ferried soldiers from the beaches back to England. While it was a huge tactical defeat and the loss of equipment was catastrophic, Dunkirk saved the core of the British Army, allowing them to fight another day. With the British forces gone, France's fate was sealed. German troops swept south, and on June 14, 1940, Paris fell. France soon signed an armistice, surrendering to Germany. In a moment of historical revenge, Hitler forced the French to sign the surrender in the exact same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice that ended World War I. Now Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill, who had just become Prime Minister as the invasion began, gave some of his most famous speeches, vowing to fight on the beaches and never surrender. Hitler, assuming Britain would beg for peace, prepared an invasion plan codenamed Operation Sea Lion. But before any invasion could happen, Germany had to achieve one thing: control of the skies. It had to destroy the Royal Air Force. What followed in the summer and fall of 1940 was the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The Luftwaffe launched huge raids, first hitting British airfields, radar stations, and factories. Later, they shifted to bombing cities like London in what became known as the Blitz, trying to break the will of the British people. For months, the battle raged in the skies over southern England. The RAF, though outnumbered, had a few crucial advantages. They were fighting over home turf, so downed pilots could be rescued and planes could be repaired faster. Most importantly, they had a sophisticated air defense network built around a new technology radar. These coastal radar stations gave them early warnings of German raids, allowing them to scramble their Spitfire and Hurricane fighters to intercept them. By the end of October 1940, it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed. Hitler was forced to postpone and eventually cancel Operation Sea Lion. Britain had survived. Failing to knock Britain out of the war forced Hitler to make a massive change in strategy. Frustrated in the West, he turned his attention to a goal he'd held for a long time: conquering the Soviet Union. In his 1925 book, Mein Kampf, Hitler had laid out his idea of Lebensraum, or living space, for Germans in Eastern Europe. He saw the Soviet Union, with its huge territory and Slavic people, as a natural target for colonization and its communist ideology as a mortal threat. The 1939 Non-Aggression Pact had always been just a temporary tactic. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers surged across an 1,800-mile front. The invasion came as a complete surprise to Joseph Stalin, who had ignored repeated intelligence warnings. At first, the German offensive was a smashing success. The Wehrmacht used the same Blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland and France, encircling entire Soviet armies and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But the Soviet Union wasn't France. The sheer size of the country and its population made a quick victory impossible. As the Germans drove deeper, their supply lines stretched to a breaking point. And then came their most powerful enemy, the Russian winter. The German high command had gambled on a quick campaign, expecting to win before winter hit. They were disastrously unprepared for the brutal cold. By December 1941, temperatures plunged. German equipment seized up, weapons froze, and soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, suffered terribly from frostbite. At the gates of Moscow, the exhausted German advance finally ground to a halt. Then, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack with fresh divisions from Siberia, pushing the Germans back from the capital. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Germany was now locked in a brutal war of attrition on the Eastern Front that would chew up the vast majority of its resources. At the same time, the war in Europe was about to officially go global. For years, Imperial Japan had been expanding its empire in Asia. It had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and had been in a brutal war with China since 1937. As Japan tried to establish its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, it ran up against the interests of the United States. In response to Japanese aggression, the US imposed economic sanctions, finally cutting off Japan's oil supply in the summer of 1941. This oil embargo gave Japan a stark choice: give up its ambitions, or go to war to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. The military chose war. To pull it off, they believed they first had to eliminate the biggest threat in the Pacific, the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor. Just before 8 a.m., hundreds of Japanese planes descended on the unsuspecting base. In less than 2 hours, they had destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships, and wiped out over 300 aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, famously calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. The wars in Europe and Asia had merged into one global firestorm. The United States, once divided on getting involved, was now united and fully committed to the fight, bringing its incredible industrial power to the Allied side. The first half of 1942 was a highlight reel for the Axis powers. In the Pacific, Japan followed Pearl Harbor with a string of victories, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and much of Southeast Asia. In North Africa, the brilliant German general Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was pushing the British back towards the vital Suez Canal. And on the Eastern Front, the German army launched a new summer offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The Axis was at the absolute peak of its power. But the tide was about to turn. A series of decisive battles in late 1942 and 1943 would shift the war's momentum for good. The first blow came in the Pacific. The Japanese High Command planned to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a final decisive battle at the tiny strategic Midway Atoll. But the Americans had a secret weapon. Their codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval code. They knew the Japanese were coming, they knew the target was Midway, and they knew their strength. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the US Pacific Fleet, used this intelligence to set a perfect trap. The Battle of Midway, from June 4th to 7th, 1942, was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. As Japanese planes were returning to their carriers to rearm, American dive bombers found the Japanese fleet. In a chaotic 5-minute span, they hit the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Decks crowded with planes, fuel, and bombs. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were turned into blazing infernos. A 4th was sunk later that day. In a single battle, Japan lost 4 of its best carriers and a huge number of its most experienced pilots, a loss from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. By late 1942, another turning point was unfolding in North Africa. Rommel's advance had stalled at the Egyptian town of El Alamein. The new British commander, General Bernard Montgomery, carefully built up an overwhelming advantage in men and tanks. On October 23rd, he attacked. After nearly 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the British broke through Rommel's lines. Just days later, in Operation Torch, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, west of Rommel's retreating army. Caught in a giant pincer, the remaining Axis forces in Africa surrendered in May 1943. North Africa was now in Allied hands, ready to be a launchpad for the invasion of Italy. But the most monumental turning point happened on the Eastern Front, in the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Hitler became fixated on capturing the city. The battle devolved into a hellish close-quarters struggle in the city's ruins, a rat war where soldiers fought for every building and every room. While the German Sixth Army was being bled dry in the city, the Soviet High Command was preparing a massive counterattack. On November 19, 1942, they launched Operation Uranus. 2 huge Soviet pincers smashed through the weaker Romanian armies on the German flanks, and within 4 days had trapped the entire German Sixth Army, some 300,000 men. Hitler forbade them from trying to break out and promised to supply them by air, an impossible task. Trapped, the German soldiers faced starvation, disease, and the brutal Russian winter. On February 2, 1943, what was left of the shattered Sixth Army surrendered. The defeat at Stalingrad was an unimaginable disaster for Germany. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army, which now began the long, bloody road to Berlin. With the Axis defeated in North Africa and, still reeling from Stalingrad, the Allies began the final push to defeat Nazi Germany. The strategy was actually pretty simple. The Soviets would keep pushing from the east, while the Western Allies would open a second front in the west to squeeze the Third Reich from all sides. The first step into what was called Fortress Europe came from the south. In July of 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The campaign was, honestly, a success, and it led directly to the overthrow of Benito Mussolini in Italy. But the fight for Italy was far from over. German forces quickly occupied the country and set up a series of tough defensive lines. The Allied advance up the mountainous peninsula became a slow, brutal, and costly slog. Meanwhile, the war in the air really ramped up. British and American air forces launched a combined bombing offensive against Germany. By night, the British bombed industrial cities in an effort to break civilian morale. By day, the Americans conducted what they called precision raids on specific factories and oil refineries. The air war was incredibly costly, but it crippled Germany's war economy and achieved the air superiority needed for the invasion of France. The ultimate goal was Operation Overlord, the full-scale invasion of Normandy, probably the most complex amphibious assault ever attempted. To succeed, they had to trick the Germans about where the attack would actually happen. Through an elaborate deception plan called Operation Fortitude, they created a phantom army to convince the Germans the main landing would be at Pas-de-Calais. The trick worked perfectly. D-Day was set for June 6, 1944. In the pre-dawn hours, airborne troops landed behind enemy lines to seize key bridges and roads. At dawn, the main assault began, with 156,000 Allied soldiers landing on 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. On most beaches, casualties were lighter than feared, but on Omaha Beach, American forces met ferocious German resistance. For a time, the entire landing really hung in the balance. But through sheer bravery, small groups of soldiers finally broke through. By day's end, the Allies had a foothold. Now came the Battle of Normandy. For 2 months, the Allies fought a brutal battle of attrition in the thick hedgerows of the French countryside. Finally, in late July, Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment, blew a hole in the German lines, allowing American forces under General George S. Patton to break out. The German army in Normandy was soon encircled and destroyed. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. As the Allies raced towards Germany, the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly pushing from the east, having launched Operation Bagration, a colossal offensive that shattered the German Army Group Center. In a last desperate gamble, Hitler launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge, as it became known, was the costliest single battle ever fought by the United States Army in World War II, but it exhausted Germany's last reserves. As 1945 began, the end was near. Allied armies crossed the Rhine River into the heart of Germany, while the Red Army closed in on Berlin. As they advanced, Allied forces began to liberate Nazi concentration and extermination camps, revealing the full, unimaginable horror of the Holocaust to the world. They found evidence of systematic genocide, gas chambers, crematoria, and mass graves, a profound shock that defined the ultimate evil of the Nazi regime. The final act was the Battle of Berlin. In April 1945, Soviet forces assaulted the capital in a savage street-by-street fight. Deep in his bunker, as his thousand-year Reich crumbled, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. On May 7th, Germany signed the unconditional surrender of all its forces. The next day, May 8th, was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. The war in Europe was over. While Europe celebrated, the war in the Pacific raged on. The Allied island-hopping campaign was a two-pronged advance toward Japan, characterized by incredibly ferocious fighting. Japanese soldiers, taught a code of death before dishonor, rarely surrendered, fighting to the last man from caves and bunkers. Battles for islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were some of the bloodiest of the war for United States forces. The battle for Iwo Jima cost nearly 7,000 American lives. The battle for Okinawa was even worse, with over 12,000 American deaths and the use of mass kamikaze attacks, giving a terrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would look like. By the summer of 1945, Japan's position was, well, hopeless. Its navy and air force were destroyed, its cities were being firebombed, and a naval blockade had cut off essential supplies. Still, the Japanese government refused the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender, vowing to fight to the bitter end. American planners estimated that an invasion of Japan could lead to catastrophic casualties, but President Harry S. Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death, had another option. A top-secret program, the Manhattan Project, had successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. Faced with the prospect of a bloody invasion, Truman made the momentous decision to use the new weapon, hoping to force a quick end to the war. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion instantly killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, leveling the city. Thousands more would die later from radiation sickness. Even after this, the Japanese government was deadlocked. Then, on the evening of August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and early the next day, launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Also on August 9, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. The combination of the two atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion was finally enough. Emperor Hirohito personally intervened and decided to accept the Allied terms. On August 15, 1945, he announced Japan's surrender to the Japanese people in a radio broadcast. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally signed the Instrument of Surrender, officially ending World War II. If this deep dive into the war that changed everything taught you something new, hit that like button and subscribe for more crucial stories from our past. And let us know in the comments, what moment from the war stands out the most to you? Your engagement helps us keep exploring these pivotal moments in human history. The world that emerged from the rubble of 1945 was profoundly changed. The cost was immense. An estimated 70 to 85 million people were dead, and the majority of those, perhaps as much as two-thirds, were civilians. Entire cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions were left homeless. The old colonial empires of Europe were fatally weakened, paving the way for independence movements across Africa and Asia. From the ashes rose two new global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their ideological clash would define the next half-century, ushering in the nuclear-armed standoff of the Cold War. The horrors of the Holocaust led to the establishment of international war crimes tribunals and new precedents in international law. In fact, the term genocide itself was coined in 1944 by a Polish-Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin to describe the systematic destruction of a people. Institutions like the United Nations were formed in the hope of preventing such a global catastrophe from ever happening again. The war also supercharged technology. Radar, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and electronic computers all saw rapid development. But its most terrifying legacy was the atomic bomb, which introduced humanity to a new capacity for self-destruction that cast a long shadow over the post-war world. From a single invasion born of aggression to a global conflict that reshaped society itself, World War II stands as a stark lesson in our capacity for destruction, but also for resilience, sacrifice, and the enduring quest for peace. It was, in every sense, the 6-year conflict that changed everything.